Welcome to episode 21 of the Marketing Operators Podcast. Today, we are doing our second episode on conversion rate optimization with a special guest, Shane Rostad. Shane is one of my favorite, most thoughtful folks in CRO. Been following him for a handful of years. Got the chance to meet, about 6 months ago. And yeah, we go deep on this one. So we're basically talking generally about how to run tests properly to get confident and actionable results. So we're talking about philosophy behind CRO testing, how to correctly set up and interpret results. We're talking about some process and operation stuff around testing. And this is a fun one. There's a lot of nuance to conversion rate optimization. So we do a pretty good job of addressing that here. As always, thank you to our sponsors, Motion, Rich Panel, Prescient AI in-house. And also, as always, if you're enjoying the Marketing Operators Podcast, make sure you like, subscribe, share it with your buddies. We want to get this in the hands with as many tacticians as possible, and we appreciate any help in doing that.
At Ridge, we are loyal users of motionapp.com. And why is that? It's because creative is the new ad targeting. 4 or 5, 6 years ago, you'd show up to Meta, you'd tell them exactly who you wanted to target, and that is no longer the case. If you want to be reaching new audiences, you need to be doing that through creative and a strategic approach to it. So what we talk about on our team all the time is creative diversity. What are the motivators, the reasons to believe, the new content pillars that we're using to reach new audiences? And all of that gets cataloged within Motion so that we can both measure what's working within each of those categories, as well as how do we measure against one another. With all the talk of creative strategy, Motion has become an industry leader in content that my team learns from and your team can learn from too. So you can go to motionapp.com and check out their webinars, subscribe to their newsletter. We've done exclusive Marketing Operators podcasts with their audience to be up to date on cutting edge creative strategy techniques. So if you're ready to join the best D2C and e-commerce brands using Motion to win at Meta, TikTok, Snapchat, go to motionapp.com, tell them the Marketing Operator sent you, and get 50% off your first month.
Had you guys met before?
Just on, I feel like just via Twitter DMs.
Yeah,
if
just
anything.
DMs.
Yeah.
Nice, let's go.
But I mentioned, Shane, you were a huge help with, we did the Sections API project. So you talked with James and Brian at length. So we're big fans of you.
Awesome. Well,
Wait, you did whose API project?
It was the Sections API. So it was like when I didn't intentionally do this,
Shane
but it's always when you like
roasted our
point something
site.
out, like kind of point,
Shane
kind
publicly
of roasted.
roasted
Well, it's like, you know,
Yeah.
when you just have an example of like, hey, when you click on the, like, if you're on a black wallet and you want to go to green, it has to reload the entire page. And that because they use separate products, and that's just like not how you have to do it in Shopify. It's definitely way easier. But they came out this new thing where you could just like instantly re-render the entire page without like refreshing it. And so I made a video about how like it looked there, and then another store where like how they had it set up. And then, you know, I felt kind of like, it's always like you feel a little bad roasting someone, but you know, it's like, 'cause that's not the intention of it. But then we talked about it, and I talked to the dev team about how to actually go about implementing those changes to make it work. And I think you're doing it now, right? You have it set up. I know that last time I talked to James, they were like, we ran into another issue because you run into all these issues with like firing pixels and stuff like that. That becomes a massive headache. But it seems like they figured it out.
Well,
We got it all figured out. Yeah.
we're gonna have to have that conversation, because if you go to our pan page and you start clicking through all the different variants, it loads a new page every time. So, which is actually selfishly.
Hey, I'll how about I'll just forward you the entire thread of my conversation with James and all the stuff, and we can talk about it, because there was the back and forth on how to get certain stuff implemented. But yeah, dude, it makes a huge. It's one of the we could even talk about this during the pod, because it's one of those things that's like not really something you would test. It's just kind of obvious that it's better.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
You know,
well, that was selfishly. That's why. I mean, Cody, I don't know when this was, like 12 episodes ago. 12 episodes when we started talking international. He's like, we are about to roll out international. This is purely me just wanting to pick your brain about how to do it. Because both Ridge and Hexclad now both have pretty robust international businesses. And that's kind of how I felt about this one. I'm like, I think we've gotten better at CRO in the last year and a half. I still think there's a lot to be desired, and just like best practices web stuff. So I'm like, all right, this is great. I'm just gonna pick Shane's brain on the podcast and try to figure it out, and probably gonna want to hire him for an audit after the show.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, always happy to, as you know, the fun thing is doing trying to do less and less consulting stuff now because I'm working on. We actually just placed a PO for product. This probably would derail us for a while if we started talking about this, but we just placed a PO for product that should arrive by October 15th, like a full initial inventory PO.
That's a good segue a little bit into this kind of first topic, because you have been in the services game for a while, specifically in conversion rate optimization.
Mm-hmm.
You're now taking a swing at a brand that you're founding or co-founding, I think. And this is, I believe, the first brand you're founding, right? Is this your first swing at a brand?
Yeah. Besides, like when I was 18,
right,
like trying to sell, all sort, like sourcing random on Alibaba and all of that, like the first inroads to e-commerce. Besides, like fidget spinners and other random,
nothing wrong with fidget spinners,
product,
by the way. Let's make it known.
Dude, they're the best.
So funny.
That's such a funny. We got burned pretty hard on fidget spinners.
Nick Shackelford crushed you on that one.
Really?
Sure
we ordered them, and we were early. Yeah, we were early, and a big bundle of them, huge box of them arrived, and we dropped one of them, and it instantly just shattered into pieces because they didn't want to tell us before shipping them that they were like, we changed the dimensions a little bit, so they were so tight that like if you tapped it, it would just shatter basically. And so we got all of them. We were like, okay. By the time we could send them back and order more, the whole craze was already like in full swing. We were like, all right, I guess on to the next one here.
Yeah.
But that was my first foray into dealing with stuff. But yeah,
that's awesome. I think Nick was involved in fidget spinners in some way. I don't know if he like was just buying ads for them or like had some ownership of like because like there is the fidget spinner brand, right? I know they're all called fidget spinners, but there's a brand that was like, it's like Kleenex fidget spinner, right?
The original. Yeah. There was an original, and then people like me just were like, hey, these are super easy to make, and they cost like 50 cents or something.
I love mine. It's the best. I'm spinning this thing around all day long.
Yeah, I'm a big fidget guy. Now I have my wedding. I'm actually not even wearing. I have my wedding ring now. So got married recently, which is awesome. But so I just fidget with that all day. Like I'm always flipping it around and stuff. It's basically like expensive.
Sounds like you're in market for a Ridge ring at some point.
I think we purchased the ring before Ridge even launched rings. So maybe I'll have to double back and get that lifetime guarantee.
If you ever lose yours or need it resized, you go to ridge.com.
Perfect. We don't usually spend too much time like going into like the bio stuff, but at least want to hear a little bit like who are you? How'd you get into growth marketing? What's your kind of trajectory been? What's like the 3 to 5 minute timeline?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it like compact because there's plenty of detail to go into. But basically I started working in marketing just like out of college as an intern. I went to school for like entrepreneurship and finance, and the whole entrepreneurship side of things was just an absolute joke. It was basically just like a general business degree. I was working for a company doing, just basic marketing. They had no marketing department. I was the only person. They're like, hey, figure out marketing. And they were building, no, it was actually, they were building apps for big brands using Salesforce. So it was super B2B focused, and I had no clue what I was doing. So I just basically tried to learn absolutely everything I could. That led me into like content and SEO because that was kind of like the craze at that time. And also for like selling B2B services was definitely like the thing to be doing. But tried learning everything I could about all aspects of marketing, copywriting, content, SEO, etc. But we were building apps, and I realized, design's kind of cool. And I met some people who were working there that were doing design and development, actually building the apps. And I always had this like weird, like this not weird, nerdy, like techie side where I was interested in that. So I was making these landing pages for partnership things that we were doing, and I was like having a great time doing it. So I just started doing a little bit more design stuff and decided, hey, I'm just going to take a course on like how to do UI design essentially, because I'm having fun building these landing pages and like actually getting a little bit more into it. And
you were actually building funnels for the apps, targeting these like businesses that were in your ideal profile.
No, I was basically building funnels for the like enterprise companies essentially. So I started it like trying to get an enterprise to sign up to build an application for their thing on using it. It was very convoluted essentially. And so essentially what we ended up doing though is like after I was making all these landing pages, because we were doing partnership events, et cetera, like all the time, we had different stuff going on to try to generate new business essentially. And I just got super into design, realized I've been working like for myself for the past 5 years. So I'm very like, I like to do everything, which is almost to a fault. And so I was like, well, if I can design it, but now I have this page in Figma. At the time it was like in Sketch, and like, what the hell am I going to do with this? Like, I can't actually, like, I can use a landing page builder or whatever, but like, I want to actually make the thing. So I ended up leaving that job to learn how to code. Went through that process because I was like, I want to be able to design and build stuff. Basically ran out of money and was like, I need to start freelancing. And the one thing when trying to get marketing clients, because at the time that's what my like most of my experience was in, I could get people that were like, yeah, I need a new website. And so I just started like basically fell into doing a ton of web design and development. But I always like, I think the thing that set me up really well to do CRO work is that I always looked at design and development from like a business perspective. Like I don't come from like the art school background of design of like, oh, let's design this and make it look pretty. Like you get some of these like, not to like call out names, but like the red antler style designs that are like super over the top and look amazing, but like aren't easy to use. And it's like, okay, how do I even buy a product on this website? Like there's so many animations. I come from the like, hey, let's ignore all of that. It might not be as like aesthetically pleasing, but I like to get results essentially. And so when doing web design, I kind of like kept that in the back of my mind.
We all have those friends, by the way,
got deeper
right?
and deeper
We all have
into
those
design.
friends that are
Yeah.
where their business is more of an art project than it is like a business. And like I have some of these buddies that I'll be texting about their businesses. I'm like, oh, like this is great that this happened. We should do A, B, C, and D. And they're just like, nah. I'm like, all right, man. Like I'm done with you.
Yeah.
Go make your brand film
And
for your brand that hasn't done $1 in revenue. Like that's fine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I was always like, I care about making money at the end of the day. And like design is fun and interesting. And I think it has like such a powerful impact on a business. Like at the end of the day, like websites are just like, they are our storefronts, you know? And so I kind of was like, hey, this is like and at the beginning it was like local businesses, then getting into like more national businesses. It's like, this is where people are finding you and trying to actually solicit your services or buy your product. It's like, clearly this should be done well. Like, or if it's being done poorly and you're succeeding, then like probably would be doing better if you just if you were put some focus and attention to it. So yeah, basically from there, I was like, where are my services most valuable? And it was either SaaS or
how many years
e-com,
in are you
and
at
it
this
was just
point?
like I had
Like from the moment you started at that agency to the moment now you're like in this kind of I'm learning how to develop and code stage.
probably like, well, I was only 2 years into working at a year and a half, 2 years into working at the agency when I left to just do my own thing and kind of dive deep into this. And then probably doing that for a few years before being like, okay, like I'd worked with a couple e-com clients, but I was like, who actually gets value out of the service that I'm providing? And if you're selling to B2B enterprises, like the guy making the sales calls is the one that's actually generating business, not your website at the end of the day. So like, that's where I was like, okay, I have previous experience in e-com. It's what I'm interested in. And then I just kind of went all in on that and started specifically being like, how do I, instead of just designing and building websites, how do I, run experiments? Like, how do I run an experimentation program? Because I feel like I could redesign a website, but like, you don't know, like you can only do that once essentially. I mean, you could do it multiple times, but like, okay, you redesign the website. Now what? Like, is it better or worse? Are you going to redesign the whole thing again? I really wanted to I was really interested in the experimentation, the testing. Obviously, I'm super results oriented, so it drew me in. And yeah, so that's how that's like my background that I think sets me up uniquely to do CRO work. Cause like I have this marketing background. I understand UX design and development, basically like that's kind of where I think most of my expertise is on that UX side, but I also like have the background in copywriting, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like a weird mix of skills that come together to be someone who can provide a full service like CRO offering essentially.
Yeah, that makes sense. And did you always have it in the back of your mind that you were going to try to launch like a big swing at a brand that you owned and were operating?
Yeah. I mean, I think for a while, my thesis on how I should go about things was like, hey, I can get really, really good at something and command like a decent hourly rate and kind of set myself up where I could always be employable. And then I can basically just take shots on goal and know that I always have like a solid income base. Like essentially because when I left that first job, I was like, and I started freelancing, like I was broke. Like I was like, there's nobody, I'm doing all the outreach I can to try to get people to, like, I had never done my own thing before. I was still pretty young. And I was like, yeah, let's like solidify a base here. Let's get really good at something so that like I'm always employable at like a decently high level. And then once I have that flexibility, that kind of gives me the, ability to just take shots on goal with bigger projects. And this one just kind of came up recently. I was like, yeah, why not? Like, let's just go for it.
I don't think that's that model, that like services, which is very cash flow positive, very high margin, especially when you're doing it at like an individual freelance scale. That model of doing services to generate cash, and then taking swings at brands that aren't going to probably generate you, or they're actually going to be a drain on cash up front and resources, but eventually could turn into something really big, especially if you don't want to scale that agency model, which is, I know personally, like I would never be interested in launching and scaling an agency the way that like Zach Stuck's done with Homestead or Taylor Holiday's done with Common Thread. Like hats off to those guys. That's just not a business model I would be very interested in scaling out. But I think it seems like, that was Zach Stuck's model all along. I mean, from the moment I met him, he's like, yeah, we're gonna do the agency thing. It's gonna be a good cash flow business, and then I wanna take some swings at some brands. So cool, man. That's a cool story. I'm excited to see and stay in touch with you on the how the brand stuff goes. Congrats on that.
Yeah, thanks, dude.
So what do the most successful brands have in common? They have great profit margins. They're lean businesses. They're actually making money. This is something the D2C industry didn't do for a really long time. And number two, they have a brand that consumers love. Now, what if I told you that you could achieve both using AI? The team at RichPanel has developed an AI that can significantly reduce your support staff while providing memorable customer service. So you can reduce costs while ensuring that consumers continue to love your brand. So here's how it works. The AI imports data from your existing help desk and uses this information to train itself. This entire process takes less than a day. Afterwards, it begins to automate numerous tasks, thereby reducing customer response times. We just switched to RichPanel at Ridge. We had been on customer. I didn't feel we had a modern stack for our customer experience team. What we're looking forward to doing is a number of things I just mentioned. We're going to reduce headcount. We're going to offer a better customer experience. We're going to make information more readily available to the consumers that are looking for it. And we think RichPanel is a great tool to do that. So the best aspect of the transition was its simplicity. We were ready to go live in 2 weeks with no data loss. Our team of 30 agents were quickly onboarded. And thanks to RichPanel's tutorial videos and user-friendly interface, it was all very seamless. If you're looking to leverage AI to save on support, payroll, and deliver a customer service experience that your customers will truly appreciate, check out richpanel.com and schedule a demo with their team.
Let's get into CRO. So I think we're going to probably get into a lot of technical stuff here, which is great. I think our audience really likes that. But before we do that, and this is going to be like come off as an obvious question, but philosophically, like why? Like why CRO? Yeah. Like why even test stuff on your website? Like outside of just like, well, to improve conversion rate and to improve AOV and to improve revenue per site visitor, like what is the philosophical why behind CRO testing? And like, is there different, lanes? Is it all one big lane? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think I actually have like a different opinion on this than most people, is that and we'll get into some of the more like fun hot takes before, but one of the things that I mentioned was like, I don't think that profit should be the ultimate goal of your CRO program. Like when it comes to running tests, I think fundamentally, like at the baseline, what you're hoping to do is just get better every day. And it's not every day, you're not running a test every day, but like you just want to be improving week over week over week. Like that's why you continue iterating, continue trying to improve. You want your store, like I had mentioned, your store is your business. Like, of course, people are, going omni-channel. I think that's great. But for a lot of brands, 90% of sales are coming through their Shopify store or whatever provider they're using, whatever platform they're using. But I just think it makes sense to continually improve your store on a monthly basis. Like know that you're just getting better and leveling up every month. And I think at a fundamental level, like that should be one of your priorities because, you don't know what you're kind of like. Of course, the whole goal at the end of the day, like we're in business to make a profit. So it's kind of like silly to say profit shouldn't be your goal. Like at really, like the only reason you're in business is to make a profit. But when it comes to A/B testing in particular, I think that a profit motive kind of skews people's behavior in a certain way. And we can get to that. But like, I guess generally speaking, I think you should run tests because it's a way to consistently and reliably improve your store month over month. And I think that's a good thing to do for like the healthier business.
Yeah. And when you say that like profit motive can skew people's motivations, are you saying that because not, in your opinion, not all like on-site CRO tests should have that final KPI of like conversion rate or revenue per user? Are you saying that there's a lot more to be improved on, and like there's different metrics depending on the test that you're trying, like if you're trying to increase the amount of people that go to a certain page and consume some content that you think is incredibly important for your brand story, like you might not necessarily expect that to turn into revenue, but you think that's lifting up like, is that what you're referring to? There's different.
I don't take it that far. Like from my perspective, I think that conversion rate or revenue per session, whichever one you choose to use, is a good indicator of something being better. Like fundamentally, we want people to come to the store and feel like they've been properly educated enough to make a purchase. Like we've removed enough barriers in order for them to make a purchase. That would be a good experience for them. Like they're coming to your store for a reason, and them finding something that they actually like is ultimately, and choosing to go ahead and purchase that is ultimately a positive experience. And so when I'm saying like we want to improve the store, it's like conversion rate is just a marker, because we'll get into this later too on how to actually interpret test results, because I genuinely think like everybody is doing it wrong, and I have occasionally too. I think most people are just totally misinterpreting what their testing tool is actually telling them. But if you have a positive effect on conversion rate, that's better. So okay, that's better. Now let's continue down that path and just be like, that's a win. Let's book that as a win, but not just like, let's try to push for 60% improvements in conversion rates, 50%. Like, I think those numbers don't really even exist in a brand that's at scale, like that already has product market fit. You can, if you lower your prices significantly. I think Connor has talked about that. Like there are ways that you can achieve that for different offers and things like that. But I just think generally, if you're always thinking, how do we maximize our dollars in using our like website, I think it leads you to trying to make short-term decisions. Because in a 2-week test, you might see that adding that little 4 people are looking at this to get it now before it runs out, you might actually see, wow, that increases our conversion rate by 20%. But like the long-term damage that it does to your brand's reputation is not being factored into that 2-week thing. So it's like, by always shooting for the biggest results, and like I guess the easiest way to visualize is that there's this, and I think Connor's also mentioned something like this in the past too, where there's essentially there's this global maxima essentially of like the best your site will ever convert. And as you get closer to that, like a qualified visitor that is like in market, the best that your site will ever convert, the average qualified in market visitor is like, there is a peak to that. You will essentially hit a peak. And the closer that you get to that peak, the harder it is to see bigger gains, because obviously you're getting closer to the maxima. So there's not massive like delta between you and there. When you're a new brand, you don't have product market fit, and you hit on an ad or an angle or a concept or something with a specific landing page, it can drastically spike your conversion rate, because you're like way down here as far as the max, the peak goes. But as you start to scale that, you just get into this like, okay, we have to go more short term. We have to go more aggressive. We have to go more kind of like influence, psychology of persuasion stuff. And I think it creates a weird like incentive in that way.
Yeah. I always say this about, it's the same with an ad account. Like when I walked into Hexclad in 2021, they hadn't launched new creative in 3 to 4 months. And I'm sitting there drooling, because I'm like, well, we're going to have a 1 in 3 hit rate probably in terms of launching creative that has an incremental or marginally better performance in terms of our like actual performance metrics. Now, 2.5 years later, it's like, shit, we might find a winner every 1 in 10, 2 in 10, 3 in, that hit rate is that diminishing return. Connor talks about this a lot with like local maximums on certain ad creatives, and like people often pigeonhole themselves because they're like, oh, we found a winner and now we're going to spend the next 2 months iterating on it. And in reality, you're like just inching towards this. Like you already got 90% of the way there with that initial launch. Now you're just kind of inching towards 95%. And instead you could have unlocked like a totally new 90% that you're not even tapping into. So it's interesting to see. We've talked a lot about that in the context of ad creative. It's interesting to hear you talk about, and that's not a unique concept to ad creative. I think that's generally the case as you're finding wins and incrementally, marginally improving across all of your channels.
Last week we talked about cheaper ads. Do cheap ads work? It was something like that. And it was like, they do, like they can get cheaper. It's the exact same thing where like, if you're just optimizing for like short-term best ROAS, like you're going to opt for like big markdowns, aggressive messaging. You're going to pull out all the like spammy little stuff, spin to win, which
we all know it too. We all know we all know we all know the little tricks. Like you're with the spin to win. Hey, you're running it right now, but like this is when you're trying to maximize on those signups. And like, I think that you don't run spin to win like year round, right?
No, we do not.
Yeah. So like, that's the thing where you get into this, I think with testing on your site in particular, there's so much damage that can be done by seeing a positive test result on something like that, because you think that removing it is going to now bring your efficiency down, but like having it there long term impacts your like how people perceive your brand, and you get into this belief system. Like you have this belief about how your website operates, and that's every test kind of tells you, like builds upon your beliefs in a certain way, which is why I think we'll talk about like how to run a test properly, because if you're incorrectly interpreting results and getting into incorrect beliefs, then you just have all this like, hey, I want to remove this. And someone's like, no way, that was a 20% improvement. Like, we can't remove that. And you're like, I don't think it's good for our brand. And someone's like, well, we already ran the test. And are we going to use another like iteration of an experiment or another set of resources to retest that same thing that we already tested? And it's like, there's a lot of like potholes that you can find yourself falling into like that. And we all know the tricks to get conversion rates and stuff up, but at what cost, essentially?
So I like this point, and then we can get to some of the hot takes, because I think we can talk about this for a long time. Because I think two things. One, I think subjectively applying constraints to your business makes sense. Like you can't like unbound optimize for profit, because you'll fall into dark patterns and like all the you'll pull out all the tricks or whatever. I also feel many brand owners apply those constraints too aggressively, where they're like, spin to win, for instance. Like people hate it. And I'm like, there's a place for spin to win. And if you don't believe that there's a place, first, like whatever, if you're Ramoa, there's no place for spin to win. Okay, I'll believe that. But like for most people, they're like applying those constraints too early for some other reason. It's like a form of like, it's like ego or something, right? People like to poo-poo the spin to win, but it's like, you can make it work.
I've experienced this with post-purchase a lot. Like I've talked to brands who feel like post-purchase, like those, hey, like the one click aspect of it, where like they just add it to their order, and then some people naturally accidentally click that button somehow, but like people do that, and then they get these customer support requests, and they're like, we're getting people who are upset. They feel like we wronged them. Like we should just remove it. And it's like, okay, well, like it's to your point. A lot of people will be like, let's not do that, because there is like some small downside, but you have to weigh the massive upside in that increased revenue that you're gaining. And it's very hard to make I think you just have to make those decisions wisely. And that's where pushing too hard for like profit optimization is, I think, where you get in this. That's why I'm not like, oh yeah, let's optimize for like trying to get people to read a piece of content. I'm like, no, we want sales. Like at the end of the day, like I want to see conversion rate going up. But at the same time, if all you're looking for is like, as a service provider, if you're being measured on how many winning tests or how many tests are over a 5% gain in conversion rate, like you're going to start scraping the bottom of the barrel in order to find those tests that hit that. Because, hey, we need one of those a month. And you're like, okay, well, I know 12 different tactics that I could implement that like will scrape the bottom of the barrel to get that increase. But like, that's not good for so it's just that incentive alignment is kind of difficult. So that's where I think it gets interesting.
There's that graph It's not as popular anymore. It was really popular like 3 years ago, where it would usually have like 3 images over 3 different timelines. Like, all right, L14, like it's like sales over time. It's like just like massive spikes. You're like, what's going on? Then you zoom out to 3 months. It's like, all right, some more spikes, but it's smoothed out. And then it was like the people that were like, just like zoom out on the big picture. Don't get, you know what I mean? It's like, all right, over time we've grown and it's been positive. The same thing applies here. Like those cheap, like do cheap tactics work? Yes, if it, in the short term, but if you zoom out and you say, okay, like let's go from a month outlook to 3 years, it probably is going to show actually a lower conversion rate at some point and a lower revenue per user. It's hard to like actually map that because you're never going to run that test for that long or whatever. But like that's ultimately what you're saying here, right? Is like you need to be optimizing for conversion rate wins, revenue per site visitor wins that are going to give you short-term wins that also translate into, you know, wins over the course of 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Like, okay, yeah, totally. I want to dig into this note because this is a juicy quote from the notes. The note was 99% of people listening to this podcast, oh damn, calling out the listeners, shit, are running their tests wrong, or at least interpreting the test wrong. I've seen firsthand people are considered top class growth marketers in this space, run A/B tests that make absolutely no sense and interpret results from them that have no basis in reality. Let's just start calling people out. Like who's a fraud?
No,
Like,
no, I'm not.
I don't think. Kidding.
Yeah. All right. Well, here's the list. Actually, Taylor Holiday. No, I'm just kidding. If anybody understands statistics, I'm sure it's that guy. So, I think that really what it is that like statistics is really complicated. I'm not a statistician. You know what I mean? Like that's not my profession. That's not my expertise. But like there are some baseline things that you should probably understand when running tests that you interpret things correctly. But like there's this quote that I really like by Richard Feynman. It's like the first principle is not to fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. And it kind of goes hand in hand with like this book. I think on the latest Operators podcast episode, Jason mentioned like the book of How to Lie with Statistics.
He loves that one.
Like if you have statistical metrics on a page, it's so easy to lie using them. Like it's so easy to tell a story about like, oh yeah, the confidence is only 73%, but like, we know this about that. And all of a sudden it's like, well, now you're actually talking yourself up to the confidence being like 95% or something. Like I think people use these metrics to like, it can be used in nefarious ways, but I just want to, maybe we should just get into like I'll try to keep these succinct and short, but like we can get into some rules, I think, that people could follow, where the reason why I bring this up is like, we mentioned this briefly earlier, but if you run a test incorrectly and you get a result that tells you either big win or big loss, you're skewing your perspective for the future. And usually you're codifying that as like a rule of like, hey, we tried that already. And because you've tried it already, you're less likely, even if you're not totally against doing something again, you're way less likely to try it again because you're like, hey, we've already done that. Like we have all these all of us probably have 50 things that like you look at a website and you're like, hey, let's try changing this. Let's try changing that. Like you can just look at it and be like, what if we tried that? You can come up with a super long list. And when you have that list and you're like, we've already tried this one, you're so much less likely to double back. And anytime in the future, 6 months in the future, someone looks at it and is like, oh, we've already tested that and this is the result. But they don't know that you ran the test wrong and that the results are like running a test incorrectly and getting results and interpreting them. And you're not even, it's like worse than just being wrong. It's just like you're not actually getting anything out of it. Like the results are totally random. So you're 50-50 chance that you're in one direction or the other. Or you might be overly confident, underconfident. And so there's a lot of downside to running testing correctly and interpreting results, which is why I feel like if like people listening to this, if they're running experiments or they're thinking about working with an agency to run experiments, having this baseline understanding of like, hey, let's set these ground rules, or at least asking them like, hey, why are we not doing this? Because they should be able to speak through like very confidently why they're not following these kind of procedures. But I can just kind of go through them and we can
let's
rules and we can
chat about
riff
the
on
rules.
them if we want.
I think it's helpful to give people just like frameworks to operate off of. So I think this will be really interesting.
Cool. So the first rule, which is the toughest thing, is that you need I would set a minimum test duration, so a minimum number of days or weeks that a test is going to run for. And included in that is this notion of sample size. Like I've had people send me test results that are like, this person ran a test and there's 4 conversions on this one and 2 on the other and 8 on the other. And they're showing 180% increase. And they're trying to say that this is statistically significant. And it's like, yeah, well, like
It's not.
that's obviously not. Like it's obviously not. But like all they know is statistical significance and they see the conversion rate increase, but they don't know like the likelihood is it's actually maybe negative. Like there's a high likelihood it's negative 180% or something like that.
Is there a number
So,
or I mean, it probably depends on like what like the performance spread is between like the variants that you're testing, but is there a number of like sample size is this at least and the number of conversions is this at least, or is that not really how it works? I'm not a statistician either,
I think
right?
that it's not necessarily how it works, but I think like a good rule of thumb that most people put out there is that at minimum you should be getting like at absolute minimum you shouldn't be running a test if you can't get 300 conversions on both sides. Using like Bayesian statistics analysis, etc. But like there's this concept from there's 2 ways of kind of interpreting test results, and I won't get into statistics mainly because it also gets over my head at a certain point. But like there's this method called frequentist statistics. It requires a lot more data. Everybody's moved to this Bayesian approach that kind of says, well, we have this data from beforehand, so we can kind of like speed up the process. Most people use that, which gives you like a probability of success. But in this like frequentist model, which some people still use for testing, there's actually there's a metric called a confidence interval, which is like you have your statistical significance, which is like 95%, but you have this thing called you have statistical power. And so statistical power is this metric of like, have we powered the test enough? Like, have we pushed enough people into the test to feel confident that we're not getting false positives? And so the kind of going like standard for that is 80%. And there's like, this is kind of complicated, but there are tools online like Conversion XL, like cxl.com. They have a A/B test calculator where you can kind of input the visitors and the conversion rate, and it will tell you like an estimated minimum test duration, because the smaller the impact is, like 1 to 4%, you need a lot more data to feel confident in that. Anything more than that, you can have less data to feel confident. Like the bigger the impact, the more confident you feel. That's all to say that like that's not how the Bayesian statistics analysis works necessarily. But it gives you a good rule of thumb where like when you do that and you're looking at what your traffic numbers are and like what your conversion numbers are, like, okay, let's set a rule of thumb of like, we should run a test for like, I have kind of some rules here where I think for most 7-figure brands, you can get really confident, like you can be really confident in your results if you run a test for 4 weeks. And I think with most 8-figure brands, it can be 3 weeks. And this obviously 8 figures is a pretty big spread, but 9-figure brands, I think it's 2 weeks. And the reason why it only goes to 2 weeks is because I think that more important than I think most brands that are above like $5 million a year or $10 million a year are going to get significant results. But the main thing with the 2-week period is that like things happen in the world. Like the stock market was down 5% in a single day the other day. Like to say that has no impact on people's buying behavior is kind of insane. So your impact, like people's psychology coming to your website has an impact on your ultimate conversion rate and what things impact. Like if it's Black Friday, for example, there's only 2 left, like order now sort of thing on your PDP might have a much bigger impact than if it's like a Wednesday in June, So by running the test for, a minimum duration of like, let's say 2 weeks, you kind of smooth out these like random events that might skew the results. And you get 2 like full business cycles where like, hey, you're running a sale for a few days in there and then you're not running a sale. You kind of like smooth out the results. And I think you can get away with running a test every week, but like at the same time, if you stop the test, do you have another test already built and developed and ready to launch that day that you're going to launch? Like, because most people are like, hey, let's stop it after a week and then let's build out another test. And then we run that for, we start that a week later. So it's like, you could have just ran the test for 2 weeks while building out a new test, but that's one rule of thumb there.
So we use Prescient at Hexclad. It's used by other top brands like Good American, Symbiotica, Timbuktu, Nude, and dozens more. Prescient AI, helping brands scale spend confidently with AI-powered marketing mix models. So if you want to check out Prescient AI's marketing mix modeling tool, go to prescientai.com/operators. That's prescientai.com/operators. Could we talk about the confidence interval stuff? Because I'm very curious about that. All right, help me out with this example. We're running this test right now. We've been talking about it on a few episodes. This desktop navigation redesign. I'm back at it. We have over 1,200 conversions on each. We have over 60,000 visits that people got funneled into the test on each. The new version that we launched has a lower conversion rate slightly, but a way better AOV. So the revenue per visitor is way better. Confidence interval on it though is, and let me actually, so we have a $7.91 revenue per visitor on V1 or the variation one, and then $7.60 revenue per visitor. So not like a massive bump, but like a bump nonetheless. I'll calculate the percentage, but my confidence interval on this is only 75.5%, right? Even though I've had over 1,200 conversions on each.
Well, and this is where I think that this so depends on what tool you're actually using, because every tool has a different like way of doing the statistical analysis and present. Like they all use similar tools, but what they present to you is different. And what you might be looking at is that 70% is like the probability that it is better than the other one. So this is where I think people get confused, and we can talk about and analyze and test results, but it's not actually a probability that you're like, is that a 3% like gain or something like
gain
that?
In revenue per visitor.
So 4%. So it's like basically saying that there is a 76% chance, 76% probability, so a likelihood that result, not it says nothing about that 4% increase. All it says is that it's probably better than the control. So there's a 76% chance that it is essentially 0.01% better to 4 to 8% better than your control. Essentially, a lot of tools, like I use IntelliGems with clients that I used, what they present is that probability to be best, which is essentially all you're saying is that it's not worse than the control. You're not saying anything about like that 4% and the reality of that 4%, if that makes sense.
Right, but there's still a 25% chance that the original page is actually better than the variation, and that the results that we're seeing are just from a variety of noise, like consumer behavior and a million other things that could be going on. We just launched a new product, and
this is where it's risky to. This is why it's risky to not wait to get actual results, because like if you like, there's different ways that people kind of go about this, but if you're at 76%, waiting to 95%, the problem is at that 4%, if it goes down to 2%, it's just going to take even longer to get 95% confident, because like the smaller the change, the harder it is to be confident, essentially. Like, hey, we're measuring really small differences, so like it's pretty hard to be sure that it's better, is just like the logical way of thinking through it. So if over time you see that go from 4 to 3, well, you might have just like added another couple days before you get to that 95%, which is like one of the challenges of interpreting test results. Essentially, it's like you kind of
running like, hey, we're just.
Well, how long have you been running it for?
Like 3 weeks at this point.
Okay, 3 weeks. And are you segmenting out mobile traffic?
Yeah, I mean, this is a desktop only test specifically. We have two separate. Yeah, this is just for our desktop redesign. So yeah, the test by design is nothing changes if you go and like filter out desktop only, because it's only showing to those people.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is one of those, like, a lot of people will give you different answers. I would say that if you've been running it for a few weeks already, this gets to the point of like your mobile traffic is way higher than your desktop. So like it makes it really hard to get confident results on desktop. I would say that on desktop, like on mobile, you probably can run a test and have results within a week realistically and like feel really confident in them. But on desktop, you're probably more like at that 4-week threshold for like, hey, if we're running I think setting your expectations differently for the amount of traffic that you're actually receiving into that experiment is a pretty important thing to do up front. So I would probably lean towards like, hey, we're going to have to run this test for 4 weeks to get a significant result. And then if it was on mobile, it would only be like 1 to 2 weeks. Obviously, like scale changes things. I know your position you're in, it's probably like you could run a test in 1 week, even though I say 2 weeks should be the minimum. But I would say just let it run for 4 weeks. And then you get into this position where you can't actually call a result. I think that you should try to actually like, it's so hard because it's so context dependent on like where you guys are in like all the background that led up to this. But likely what you want to do is not just say, hey, we're 70% confident in this result. You might just say, cool, let's go on and move it. But there's the downside risk is that it's actually worse. And now you're just iterating on a worse concept. And so what I would tell you to do is try to assess, okay, this only was a 4% improvement, but we made did we change enough? Like, did we actually make big enough changes? What did we change? How can we modify it even further to try to see a bigger impact, to see if this, like, what is the thesis behind the change in navigation? And like, how can we lean into that even stronger? Because the baseline, if you end a test without a confident result, it's like, it's really no different is essentially what you're getting at. Like maybe you didn't change enough, like your thesis of like, hey, we're driving people to collection pages a lot harder instead of trying to get them directly to a product isn't actually impacting customer behavior. So like that's one takeaway, but if that's what you're testing, then I would say just try to make it go even further with the change essentially to try to get a bigger result.
Because do you have any thought that like you should never conclude a test before it's at a minimum confidence interval? Like we use and we should go into this at some point, but like basically we use convert.com and then we have a webhook that's connecting Shopify and like GA to Convert. And then so that's the confidence interval that I'm looking at here is convert.com's reported confidence interval. Like, but do you have a minimum that you're like, you should never conclude or is it context dependent?
Well, this goes into like how to run with the principles for how to run an experiment. Like I think you should honestly run the test for the duration that you pick beforehand and then end the test when it hits that duration and interpret the results from there. Because with most of these, like with at least, and I'm not super familiar with Convert, but with, for example, like in IntelliGems, they have this ability to look at you kind of have a tolerance level and a probability to be best. So it'll tell you like, hey, if I'm willing for this to be 1% worse, like what is the odds that this is no worse than 1% worse than the control, but actually this much better, at whatever we're getting, like actually better. Like what's the probability it's going to beat it? And if it doesn't beat it, what's the probability it's going to be 1% worse? So that might be, for you, that might be like only 54%. And so when you're looking, like you can dive a little bit deeper and then just be like, I would just end the test and say, let's interpret the results. Because otherwise you have to have a rule for stopping it. And this is why I think duration works, because you could just have another thing queued up and ready to go while you're interpreting this result. So it kind of lends itself to a process of improvement where you have, hey, you're running for this duration. And then at the end of that, hey, we have this next test, maybe in a different area, whatever. We have another test queued up to run for the next 2 weeks. And while you're kind of running that, you can interpret the results and try to be like, hey, let's like have an honest conversation about, is this navigation actually having an impact at all? And like, is it worth putting more effort into? Because if you're not seeing like 3% is obviously a change, but it's on your desktop traffic. Like we're segmenting down into segments, So that's how I would kind of go about the process.
So I have a quick question on this one. The process of interpreting results. I'm curious. We talk about conversion rate, or you look at like contribution margin per visitor, things like that. And I'm sure this changes like significantly depending on what you're actually testing. But what are some of the other data sources and like behaviors that you actually look at when interpreting test results?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is just looking at the core metric of, conversion rate and revenue per session. But then ideally you want to look at like how it's affecting new versus returning visitors. Like you can kind of segment down. This is another reason to run tests for longer, because you get more data. So when you go into segments, you can be more confident in those segments essentially. So I honestly used to use Google Analytics for this a lot. Just actually like looking at the two different groups. I don't use it as much anymore because GA4 is like painful and I haven't spent the time to really double down on it. But looking at like, you can start to look at when you're trying to make a justification of like, hey, do we think this is actually having an impact? You could start to go down the list of like time on site, like how you can look at how different cohorts of users are behaving essentially on the site, how many pages they're looking at, et cetera, to think like, okay, is there something here? Because when you start looking into those behavioral metrics, for example, with what Connor's doing, you might see, okay, these metrics also look exactly the same. Like people are seeing just as many pages, people are spending just as much time on site. Like clearly this isn't actually impacting their, behavior very much. So we need to make a much bigger change. Or like you might see, wow, people are spending a lot more time on site, seeing a lot more pages. And then that might change the way, hey, for this next variation, let's change these things, et cetera. So I like to look at the two different segments in those behavioral metrics, but really that's only if it's up for debate, essentially. Like if you have a confident result that this is better and you feel like from a conversion rate, revenue per session, like your core metric perspective, then like publish it, like just launch it and then move on to the next test, essentially. I really go into those detailed metrics only when it's like a hard debate of like, are we going to spend more time trying to like improve this when we're not seeing any actual difference,
Yeah, totally.
So as I'm doing this live, this is great. This is why I wanted to have you on, Shane, because I'm now doing this live as we were talking about it. So our new user,
you're working.
I'm
right
working.
Now.
This
is
great.
Like you're on the clock for
this
xCloud
is a
right
working
now.
session.
Yeah.
When I actually broke it out and I just selected new users, revenue per user up 10%, 91% confidence, which is ultimately what I was hoping to get out of this, was a bump in new. When I look at returning, our revenue per user is actually down, not significantly, but it is down. But I'm less concerned about that because at the end of the day, like most of the repeat orders that we're going to get are probably going to come through. Like we're creating awareness, right, about all the products we have, and like people are going to come to site either through a like marketing funnel that's going to be super streamlined, or they're going to come to the site and like know exactly where they want to go. I am more like
one thing I'd say is that with GA, this is where like it's so hard to like actually get good data on some of this stuff, and you have to go layers deeper. Like for example, I'll just say, before getting into that, one thing you can do is tag orders by test and then do like order analysis afterwards, which can be really helpful to see like the different types of orders people are placing. Are they buying sets more? Are they buying individual pans more, et cetera? But like in your position, new versus returning users, that can be someone like came to your site and left and then came back, not somebody like came back because they already purchased before and they're buying again, because GA just gives you that like basically session based. So someone could even like, Google does their best to kind of like pull these people together, but you get into this, like that's somebody who's come to your site, left, and then come back. So what you can do, and this is where someone at your scale can do some stuff that's more sophisticated like this, you can trigger tests based on certain query parameters, essentially. And so if you're like, hey, we know that we're getting on this campaign, we're getting 80% new customers, like we're like 80% of people are net new. Let's trigger a test based off of those query parameters or the landing page we're sending them to, and only enter people. Like if you want to see how the impact it has on new customers, you can kind of do that because you know that those are people. If you want another variation, is like, this is again at scale, you can do this because you can do like, you can get a reasonable sample size, maybe not on desktop, but like, hey, if you send an email only to returning customers, for a specific promotion, you can trigger a test based off of that and be like, hey, we only started this test with returning customers. And you might be able to get some signal out of that at the volumes that you're doing. But again, getting so segmented and detailed is like, I think if someone's a low 8-figure brand, it's going to be really hard to get that detailed. So that's why I lean on like, hey, you can dig in to see if it's worth putting more effort into this and dig into these metrics. But at the end of the day, I would say just like end the test at a set duration. Don't just leave them running forever and move on to the next one, or make a decision. Hey, let's try again. Essentially, let's try again to get a confident result. If that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. All right, we went in the weeds there. We got stopped at rules to follow. All right, number one, you have to have a minimum test duration in days or weeks. It scales up or down depending on your revenue levels. All right, rule number two. Let's keep going through these.
Yeah, this is you guys were talking about this literally like last week. I don't know when you recorded it, but you were like talking
Oh
about peeking
no,
at test
don't.
results in one of your tweets of like how fun it is and how everybody does it. But like there is a downside, I think, to actually doing that, because you were even saying like you get this
Yep.
euphoria where like you look at it, and you're like it's a winner, and then like the result comes down so significantly, and you're like, oh, that 30% improvement is now only 7%, and cool, 7% still a win, but it feels way less compelling than 30%. Like you're way less
Dude, you could
excited
literally
about
hear
it.
it in my
And especially
voice
if it goes
when I was just looking at it. I was like, "Oh, our new
yeah.
users, it's 10%." I'm like,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. What you start to look at these things and you kind of bias yourself. And look, this is like on the margins level of impact, but when you bias yourself, like in a continuous testing program where you're trying to get better month over month, you have to make decisions about what you're going to test. And if you see something on day one have a 30% improvement, like this navigation, if you were like, hey, day one, we saw 30% improvement in revenue per session, this is going to crush it. And then 2 weeks in, you're at 4%. And you're like, I don't know, man. I think we could get to 30% if we just tweak this and we really work it out. Let's put some more effort into it. Like, let's double down. But in reality, if you let this test run for another 4 weeks, it might go to 0. And it's like, hey, maybe your whole thesis around the desktop navigation was wrong or just isn't actually important. And you should, like, there's a reality where you shouldn't be spending any more energy on it because it's not going to have some massive impact. Hey, implement the new one. There's a high probability that it's going to be better, and just like be okay with it. Try maybe doing another iteration on that. Like, can we improve this? But if you're not seeing big changes, you should be making the decision to focus your resources and your energy elsewhere, especially with a desktop navigation test that's like 10% of your user base or your something like that. It's likely that like that energy could be better spent on a mobile navigation test where it's 90% of your user base. You know what I mean? So that's where I think peeking at results and seeing things that just really mean nothing at the end of the day can impact how you kind of make decisions going forward.
And there's also, that's even,
I know nobody's gonna actually do this, so it's fine. Like I still don't do it. Like I try to look away for a few days and then like I end up checking. But like, dude, definitely don't look at it the day after because it's just so meaningless and it does really mess with your emotions. Like give it at least a couple days before you take a look.
The day after, a whole 24 hours. Dude, we probably have like we probably have like 4 or 5 conversions in that.
Yeah. And I think that confirmation bias
it's
is
really
more relevant in like there's a lot of ego in e-commerce, and like that confirmation bias becomes even more enhanced when you add in like very strong egos, which like I understand why that's the case in a role in a job where, I mean, 99% of people in the workforce in the United States have, or probably higher, have no direct attachment between their work and like how that drives top line or bottom line top line revenue growth or bottom line profit margin growth. And that's one of the coolest things about this job is like you have an immediate instantaneous connection to what you're doing and how that affects those things. But I think that confirmation bias that can come into play is like even more enhanced because of that.
Yeah. And it's, I don't think anybody's actually going to change that behavior, but like there is a downside. If you end tests, if you're under the mindset or your agency ends tests when you get a confident result, like a statistically significant result, for example, if you're looking in Intelligems and it says 95% probability to be best on day 2, but you should be running tests for 2 weeks after listening to this conversation and they end the test, there is actually like a statistical problem with the analysis where like you can get false positives and you can get, hey, in reality, like I think even in like AA tests, you get like 11% false positive rates where like there's absolutely no change. You will get false positives throughout the course of when you should be running the test. So there is actually a downside to it. Like just, you can see it, whatever, but like don't end your test because you're like, oh my God, look at this result. Let's end the test. We have 95% probability of it being a winner. And then you end it. And then you think you just like did the e-commerce equivalent of curing cancer with your test because it's 80% improvement. But like, that's not actually the case. So I would say that's the last piece on that. But I really like, I don't know. I think that the next thing on the list, we can skip one of them, which is just run your desktop and mobile tests separately. Like they're different audiences. You should treat them differently. Most people just run tests from mobile because you're 90% of your traffic. If you're a 7-figure store, you're not going to get results on desktop that actually mean anything. But on the next one,
what real quick pause on that one? Are you saying, because like obviously you can go into any test that you run and say, all right, we ran this to both mobile and desktop, and now I can filter out by mobile and desktop. Are you basically saying that like the actual like user experience swings that you're taking should be different? You shouldn't just like have this end all user.
They should be different. Yeah, they should be different, but also you're just not, for most brands up until like a certain size, you're just not going to get, like, for example, your desktop test, you have to run that test for 4 weeks to get a significant result. And you're hex clad. Most people listening to this aren't hex clad. They don't have the volumes that you're doing. And so it's like they probably can't actually, like, it's not reasonable for them to run a test on desktop unless they're going to run it for 6-7 weeks.
There's
or something,
mobile tests
or just
that,
massively
like, with certain contexts where we're doing things like you mentioned, where we're only like we're using a trigger URL that's only accessible through our Facebook ads, and we have a super long consideration period. So a lot of people are getting this test, seeing it, not converting, whatever, maybe converting later. But like, we've been running this Knives landing page test for 4 weeks now, and we still only have 30 conversions per variant. I'm like, what do I do to sit here and let this thing run for 4 months? Like, yeah, exactly. I'm like, Jesus, like this
forever.
Yeah, it's like it's hard.
That's where I think you have to make the decision on like what is actually worth your time, because if you're only getting that many conversions, the impact on your revenue is also going to be that little. Like, you know what I mean? So like when you run experiments, that's where one of the choosing what tests to run is like, look at what percentage of your traffic is impacted by this experiment. Like if it's on a singular product page, it might only be 9% of your traffic, even though like a navigation thing is like 100% of your traffic because everybody sees it. But on a specific PDP, it might only be 9% of your traffic. So you're like, oh my God, we increased conversion rate for this bundle by, and it might be your core bundle, whatever, caveats set aside. But like a 10% improvement there is only a 10% improvement on 10% of your traffic. So that's only a 1%. Like, you know what I mean? Like when you start really thinking through like how crazy do you want to get about trying to find, spend time on these things. But those are the decisions.
That's the example where I think you do need to go and dig into the data outside of just revenue per visitor. Because where my head immediately goes then is, okay, we clearly don't have enough conversions per variant to conclude this test. But is there any connection I can make in saying, okay, do folks that hit this landing page ultimately have a higher chance of converting than overall time because that first touch point is just better? And like that's when it's like, how can I create that? Like, is there some sort of, I don't know if you could, right? Because if someone,
well, and that's where I think Facebook is a better avenue for testing sometimes for things like that, because you can see spend data is a little bit like, I feel like you could be a little bit more confident in like Facebook being like, hey, you can profitably acquire a customer to this page, but to this page you can't, essentially. And like that's a different, you might be able to get less conversions to have Facebook tell you from like an acquisition perspective, hey, this isn't, like this page is just not working to convert customers. And that's a pretty good indicator. Whereas if you tried to split that traffic evenly, like send traffic to one page from Facebook and then split it, you kind of have only a certain amount of conversions, and so it's kind of hard to like. There are different avenues that you can use for testing things. Like you can test things from your ad account.
Either you set it up post click like this, or I have to go in and say, all right, I have 3 separate ad sets, all with the same ad, all with the same ad spend, product page, collection page, landing page. So it's like either way, it's right, isn't it? I mean, it's like either front loaded or post click back loaded in terms of where you're splitting the traffic. But like I'm still going to spend a bunch of cash to...
I think that what you get when you do it in Facebook is you get the actual like the different set like ad sets and like their performance essentially, which you don't get when you split it when they get to your site. Essentially, like when they get to your site and then you split the traffic, you don't get the difference in like those actual like in platform Facebook metrics of like what your return on ad spend was, because you're sending all the spend to one and then sending some of those people off to the other. So that's where you can see like in Facebook, you could see like, hey, we tried sending people to this landing page with these ads and like they're not converting at all. Like, okay, you could probably, even if you just sent other traffic via split test, it's probably going to show you a similar thing.
And in your MTA, you get a longer, like if someone doesn't convert in this post-click test, like that data is never going to show up in that test. But if you set it up at the Facebook level, like I could go into Northbeam and be like, well, show me 60-day clicks and views, show me lifetime clicks and views. And then you actually can see that attribution over time, even if they don't convert like in that actual session that they clicked on and saw right after they saw the ad. So yeah, I guess you get that longer tail, which is, it's a good point.
So one of the buzzwords this year is incrementality. Last year was all about attribution. This year is all about incrementality. And I think that's a great thing because we are all trying to grow our businesses profitably. And we want to make sure that the spend that we are putting out into market is actually is working for us. So I know that we are all house customers and you guys have sought out house this year. What led you guys to do that? We'll start with Ridge.
For us, it's all about new channels. We're in the business of reaching net new male audiences. So when we're launching across Pinterest, Twitter, Snapchat, Live Intent, etc., we use House to measure the total impact of those new channel experiments.
That's awesome. How about HexCloud? What are you guys looking at?
Definitely the new channels as we roll those out, but because we already had such a diversified marketing mix in terms of channels and we were already spending at pretty high levels prior to onboarding House, the first batch of testing is just for us to find those optimal spend levels with our existing marketing stack and then comparing those to one another to kind of see within our existing marketing stack, where should we bring spend down, where should we bring spend up, and really using that incremental ROAS, that incremental CAC number to inform how we move those budgets up and down.
I love that. Yeah. And for us, the same, we've definitely tested new channels, but we've also calibrated spend on existing channels. We've saved 6 figures a month just by not running brand search because we've ran multiple tests and it's not incremental. So I know for all of us, it's had a huge impact and we love it and we couldn't live without it at this point. And so if you want to be like us and want to add scientific rigor to your marketing stack, I recommend you go to house.io/operators. That's HAUS.io/operators to get a demo today.
I just worry you introduce like so many more variables. Same. Like all of a sudden you get ad sets, like one ad set gets a couple conversions earlier. Like, is it optimizing better? It's like a self-fulfilling thing at that point. So we prefer doing it all post-click. So we'd like set it up based on UTMs, just run it in IntelliGems. And then you're forcing all the traffic through like whatever ad sets you've set up in the account.
Yeah. No, I think that's the way to do it. But when looking at these small like data sets, essentially, like, hey, this, for example, like this 30 conversions on each thing over the course of weeks, like you might want to look at other, if you really want to learn that, you might need to look at other avenues to learn that, because otherwise like you're not going to get it through that post-click like testing.
And Connor, do you have a sense of,
but is it even worth it?
Do you have a sense of like your average, like roughly your average, like from like awareness to conversion path? Because like the brands that have quicker, shorter windows, they're certainly at an advantage when it comes to having these tests get more conversions and hit stat sig quicker. Whereas like we are like the worst like for that. It's like we're at the total opposite end of the spectrum. Like we are just not an impulse buy. 1 day, 7 day is our least common consideration periods. It just makes it much harder, I think.
Yeah. No, we have a pretty significant consideration period. What our customers tell us is 40% of people have known about us for 30 days once they purchased. There's a lot, and we see that like, I mean, when we go on promo, we see like the prospect list convert, things like that. Like there's a certain type of customer who takes a while. That being said, it's like $100 AOV. Like when we're doing CRO tests or we're looking at something like conversion rate, we're looking at it on a very short time frame.
Which is also a problem because now you're only getting data from like a very certain type of customer. Like you're actually like, well, we're getting this data from our least common customer type, which is concerning. Like the people that hear,
totally.
I don't know. It's there.
You have to take everything.
It's caveats all the way down,
man. It's convoluted.
Yeah.
Which is why, again, I think this is why, like you start having these conversations and you start getting into reality, and you're like, oh yeah, maybe like these testing programs are not where we should be like trying to drive massive growth. Like I think we all understand that this isn't like a massive lever for growth, but it's like there's so many caveats and stuff like that that I just go back to like, hey, are we actually getting like, are we at least confident that things are getting better every month?
Yeah.
You know,
so
like,
I was going to make
are
that
we
point
getting
too.
better?
Yeah. You need tools to improve. Like you need tools to get better. And that's what this is. And it's not necessarily you're not going to get the clarity or the certainty to say we've gotten 40% better with this test that we just ran over the last 3.5 days.
Yeah. And I think that leads into like, I just want to say we can talk about things that like you shouldn't do. There's one other piece that I wanted to mention, but I think one thing with interpreting results to what you just said of like, hey, we got this 40% improvement. I think the main thing with interpreting results that I think most people should understand is that when people say that a test will generate a certain amount of incremental revenue into the future, it just makes absolutely no sense. Like it just, when they say, oh, we like this test generated an incremental $40,000 a month in sales for this brand, it's like, you never see the $40,000 in incremental sales in the month. Like, I don't know anybody who's been like, oh yeah, you know what? We saw a massive revenue spike on the back of this one experiment. That's not what happens. And so the reason why is because what you're actually seeing with that like conversion rate increase, that's 4% you're seeing, that is the midpoint in the distribution of conversion rates, essentially. So 50% of people are below that and 50% of people are above that. And so the actual thing that you're being confident in is probably like that distribution does go over a negative conversion rate. Like there is still chances that that's negative. So there's like, let's say at that 4%, there's probably a 75% chance the change is within 2% and 6%. And so hey, like you keep running the test, you might get more confident in that result. Those bands start to come in and like, converge. But the reality is that 8% you're seeing is not 8%. Like you're not 100% confident you got an 8% result. There's a good chance it's 0 to 8%. And it might even be 2%, which is why the whole like, yeah, we're getting this major like incremental revenue boost, or we're using this as like a lever for growth. It's just, there's so many caveats within that where I feel like people should just be aware of like the ROI you're getting on your testing program is not always as great as it seems when using that sort of a way of attributing, success or measuring success.
I have a question. So we talk about, I'm trying to think like, what do I want to take away from this generally? And I overall like the approach of like, hey, what we're trying to do is get better, and these are tools in order to do that. And like, there's just a lot of caveats and a lack of clarity and largely statistical insignificance. But when it comes to getting like improving your site, making it better, providing a better experience for customers, do you see any parts that brands undervalue, like often overlook?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is probably merchandising. Like I think it's just like, I mean, obviously physical and digital is different, but like when you go into a store, you kind of like what products they actually have and how they present them is like a big thing that will impact what you ultimately purchase. And like having a strategy around how you show people specific products, et cetera. Like showing people, for example, like when they land on your site, if the main thing you're pushing them to is a singular product versus if the main thing you're pushing them to is a bundle of products, is going to have a pretty big difference on, because most people are going to see the one that you push them to. So you can kind of guide people's journey, and you could try to get them to click on the things that are maybe higher AOV or bring more higher contribution dollars like per session to your store. And so much of what we're trying to do with CRO is just do better merchandising. If we're trying to get people to the right products or the products that they want. One example is kind of like a example is I just spoke with someone recently. There's a brand called Paragon Fitwear. They sell like shapewear leggings, and we were having a chat, and they told me that a couple of years ago they tried to release like loungewear, and they had like their whole thing was like fit, like very fit women, selling like shapewear leggings. And they tried to release this loungewear, and they had some models that were like not in their core demo, and they tried to expand their product categories essentially, and their conversion rate tanked. All they did was add the loungewear to their site essentially, like, and their return on their evergreen ads that they were running to their shapewear dropped, because as people were exploring, they're like, oh, maybe this brand isn't for me. Like they're selling these products. It's kind of like if Hexguy just started selling or Rid just started selling random, like obscure, like, I don't know, maybe you could sell, like a deodorant. Exactly. And then they're like, why the hell are you selling deodorant? It's just weird. Like it throws you off. Like, is this a marketplace or is this a brand? Like you start getting all these weird things popping into your head. And so I think making those decisions, and the one other example I'll give is I know of a brand who is selling a product where it performs so much worse that like when you remove that product from the site entirely and you only have the one hero product, like all the metrics just get better, because even just adding one additional product, it increases confusion. And if that product doesn't work, it's like, it's really bad for conversion rates overall. And so the actual decision of what, like, this goes all the way down to like the product development sort of side of things. Like, you can't help it sometimes, but making some products less apparent or more apparent, or, putting things in certain places, that's the sort of thing that I think tends to have a pretty big impact on sales, that a lot of people just like, they have a collection and they haven't even changed how it sorts. Like, they just sort by like, whatever, like featured or however they made the collection. It's just random. And they haven't even thought about, maybe we should have our best sellers, or maybe we should have our most expensive items, or maybe like those sorts of things do have an impact ultimately on conversion rates and on the amount of money that you'll make.
You totally, but even that, like, okay, so we have like a collection page full of wallets, like A/B testing. Well, what do we want towards the top or the bottom is surprisingly difficult.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It's like it just comes down to like, I like, we make decisions like that all the time. And it comes down to like, well, what do we feel better about? Like, or we're duplicating the collections page. I guess you could do that. You could duplicate the collections page. You could reorganize, you could A/B test it that way or something. But a lot of these things just end up feeling like surprisingly tricky.
Yeah. They're tricky. And then at the end, you might get a result like what Connor's dealing with, which is like, hey, we don't really know like which way this should go. And then you're like, well, where do we go from here? And the result is like, I think this is why I think most tests, when you're building them, like, you should have a thesis behind like why you're making change. Like, why are you changing the collection page to look this way? Like, I think a lot of people go into tests without, I'm not saying either of you do, but a lot of people go into tests with just a general, like, I think this is better. But it's like, what actually makes this better? For example, like, hey, we changed our collection layout, and so we have these like offers at the top that are like our best performing wallets. Like, these are the ones that are actually our best selling, or really just like, I don't know, we have these collaborations or we have these offers, et cetera, and we put those at the top because of X, Y, and Z, rather than like, I don't know, we think that these wallets are better or something like that. Like, that's not the best example, but just like, the better example I could give is like when making changes on, for example, a homepage. If you're going to change, hey, we should update our copy on our homepage. And it's like, well, why are like, what is the actual underlying thesis for updating the copy? If you're just like, we want it to be better, it's like, okay, but like, who do you want to speak to? Like, the idea could be, hey, we have, female runners that are our largest demo. So our copy and maybe even the images on our homepage should be really geared towards like the problems that group of people has. And like, by changing that will improve our conversion rates because we'll be speaking to our core demo. And if you don't see that, then you're like, oh, okay, like, it doesn't really matter, that we speak to those people, or maybe you could try a different thing. But if you get a significant result, then you're like, oh, cool, it does work. We should change, maybe try this elsewhere. We should, maybe target our ad creative a little bit more, double down on that audience. And I think a lot of people just like, it is hard because people just like, you fall into the default of not having like a strong thesis going into it, or afterwards like a strong opinion, because the data is just kind of mild.
There's also business, like Taylor Holiday talks about this or has in the past. There's business context that is so critical. Like, people will go into an ad account and be like, why are you running this campaign or this ad set? Like, it's way lower performing than these other campaigns. But in reality, businesses have agendas. Like, they need to liquidate certain products. They can't just have a product sitting on shelf forever just because the 1-day click ROAS is 20% lower than the best performing product. And it's the same thing with CRO. Like, Ridge might make the business decision to merchandise some wallets towards the top of the collection for a few weeks, even if short term that actually drives a worse revenue per user. Because like, that's the reverse example of what we were talking about earlier with cheap tactics, where like short term that is going to drive a like net negative for the business, but long term that's a good thing, because it's way better for Ridge to have liquidated that product or Hexclad to have liquidated that product than it is to have it sitting there for the next 4 years catching cobwebs.
This is why I think most best practices, they don't apply in a lot of places, but especially when it comes to CRO, of like, oh, you should like, I'm guilty of this. Like, I've done this before. Like, I did it with Ridge, for example. We were talking about that before we started, about the like, switching the products and using the sections API or whatever. It's like, you should do things this way because of like a best practice. It just usually doesn't take into account any of the actual like priorities of the business. And so that's why the CRO work that needs to be done is like very intensive and can't really be done from like it's hard to do it just at like a glance, essentially.
Yeah. Honestly, we should do like I would love to do like a part 2, part 3 here, because there's a lot we haven't gone into yet, and this has been awesome. So I don't know. Yeah, I think we could probably turn this into like a nice little series if we want, which would be cool. But should we?
Yeah, I think we talked a lot about what not to do, which I think is important for a lot of brands in the space, because most brands are working with I think for context, I think a lot of brands in your audience are probably working with a vendor to do their CRO, because it's not something that you usually have the skill set to do, or maybe they're doing it internally. But you want to know that the decisions that are being made, like you can have confidence in them. And so having like a little bit of a gut check on like, are you following these practices, that at least you can be sure that the changes that someone's making to your store are like, they're confident that they're actually going to move the business forward. And yeah, that's the biggest. I think there's a lot of downside risk that we want to protect with brands at these scales by actually doing things correctly, and making sure that they're actually getting real results. But there's a lot of stuff that like, there's the other side of like, what should you do? It's very brand specific, but there's some general things that like, I don't think we got into a ton here. But
well, let's do it. Let's do I mean, we have next week's episode slotted, but after that, like we're pretty open, so we could definitely slot in some CRO part 2, part 3 if we want.
Yeah, we can go deep on like on more actionable things for people to do, instead of just telling people not to look at their not to peek at their test results. You know,
like, and that's like being like that's going to be the like, advice taken least.
Timeout. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah. Well, should we get into the test of the week?
Yeah. So with the test of the week, the thing that I want to talk about, and again, this is kind of in the spirit maybe of this conversation, is that the test that running with someone currently, for context for everybody, I'm working on this brand, building it. I'm doing less and less CRO work now, like trying to actually focus on one thing, but still work with brands. And so one test that we're running right now is a free shipping threshold test, which I think is always kind of like a hot topic of conversation of like, are you throwing away margin? Are you actually getting like better performance on your, in your ad account or not? Like, where does this land? And so the test that we're running is it's a hair care brand, and the test is 30 pounds. It's a UK brand, so it's 30 pounds, 50 pounds, or 60 pounds as a free shipping threshold. Historically, for a long time, it's been 50 pounds. We thought, hey, this is like protecting margin. Maybe we should move it up because we could protect margin even more. And if it's not having that big of an impact on sales, then like, why not set it to 60 and just get back some of that shipping revenue, essentially. But there's also the other side of the coin where, like most people, they're trying to reduce their customer acquisition costs. And we're trying to see if, hey, maybe if we lower it, and most people with their entry offers, it ends up being like 30 pounds or around 40 pounds. Like if we include all of those people in this free shipping, is the increase in performance going to be enough to offset the shipping costs? And what I thought I would find, and this kind of spawned because we were talking about it, and then I heard on the Operators podcast, Mike Beckham say that they changed their free shipping threshold down for similar reasons. They moved it up because people were telling them, increase your AOV, and then they moved it down and they saw a massive improvement. Why I thought this was interesting is because what we're actually seeing from these test results is basically no difference. The conversion rate is actually down slightly for people with a lower free shipping threshold at 30, which I feel like is kind of counterintuitive. And I want to get into why I think that's the case. And this kind of gets into how to analyze a test and make plans for what to do next. We're seeing an actual reduction of like 1.8% in conversion rate. Can't be super confident in that, but that tells us like that doesn't really make sense. We're basically giving a ton of people free shipping, and it's having no impact on conversion rate. Like, what's going on here? And the takeaway that we have is like, first, we need to do the order analysis. So we're tagging every order because we're using IntelliGems to run the test. You can set up using like Shopify Flow. You can tag all of your orders based on their IntelliGems test ID. And so we're tagging all the orders and then using an analytics tool in order to actually look at how the split of orders changes. So one thing you can do when doing this order analysis is you could say, what is the percentage of new customers that actually we acquired during this test, and what is the percentage of repeat customers? Because we talked about beforehand, you can't really get that new versus returning visitor kind of split. You have to get it somehow afterwards. And so by doing the order analysis, you can see, hey, of these orders, was this the first order or was this like a second plus order? And then you can compare those rates and see what the difference is between the two test groups and say, hey, in this test group, or the three test groups in this case, what is the, percentage change in, group A in new customer revenue? Because what we're trying to achieve ultimately, something that you mentioned, Connor, is like we're trying to ultimately achieve this new customer acquisition cost reduction. Essentially, we're trying to acquire customers more efficiently. So that's one thing we're doing here come like Monday, where we're going to actually dive into that and try to get some answers on that. But the more important takeaway from this is that the design of the test was probably just not done super well. And so even like I've been doing this a while, still, set things up where I'm like, why is this not showing an increase? And the problem is that on the site, 60% of customers are returning customers, and they've bought before, and the free shipping threshold has been the same for 2 years. And so you have this like, you can't just ignore the fact that like things have been a certain way for years, and a lot of customers are coming back and they just don't expect things to change. Like they don't expect prices to change. They don't even notice like these small things because they're just like, oh, I'm just buying my shampoo and conditioner again. And so my thesis is that, hey, for these returning customers, we're not making it obvious enough, because the only place that it's seen is in the announcement bar and then in the cart, but it's not like super obvious in the cart. It's not like a whole progress bar sort of thing. It's very like sort of minimal. And so my thesis is, hey, let's rerun this test. So talking about, hey, we don't really have a result here. So how do we actually get a result? Let's rerun this test, but let's put it in kind of like bold text on the product page, like free shipping on orders over this amount. So we can make it very clear, like, hey, if you are in the 60 threshold, 60 camp, you're no longer getting free shipping on your 50-pound order, which will reduce conversion rate likely. And the other group where they're like, oh my God, I'm getting free shipping on a 30-pound order, like, I didn't realize that will actually impact them more. And so that's how we're kind of redesigning the test to try to restart it on Monday to be like, hey, let's just make it really obvious and try to really inflate. Because granted, this is a big change. Like free shipping or not free shipping is usually a pretty big change. And so that's how we're trying to change the experiment to make it more obvious, to get a real result, instead of just being like, well, it looks like, there's no difference, so let's just end the test and keep 50. We're going to kind of do that next set of iterations. And so I just thought that was a good example of like how to work through ambiguity in test results. And also kind of interesting that maybe the result is, I'll have to send you guys a message afterwards once we actually rerun this test. Of like, the result might be that nobody cares about the threshold, which would be just as interesting to us. So yeah.
So is your guys' KPI really around new customers? Like that's ultimately what you guys care about?
Ultimately, that is what the business cares about right now, given its priorities for growth, essentially, because it's doing really well at extracting value from existing customers, and that's going really well. But new customer growth has slowed, and customer acquisition costs have risen. And so while they're growing mostly based off of their returning customer revenue. And so they're like, hey, that over a long enough period of time, we need to keep acquiring new customers. And so that's part of their, that's the big objective with this. But obviously there's business case of like 60% of customers are returning. We're losing a ton of money on shipping revenue. That's not going to work either. So we're keeping that stuff in mind. But the ultimate goal going into the test is like, can we get much more profitable acquisition spend on this?
Yeah, totally. I was curious just because in theory, there's a negative impact on returning customer conversion rate because they are familiar with the certain price threshold. And then if you find like, hey, new customer acquisition is better at a different threshold, then those customers will be familiar with that one. Like it slowly kind of normalize over time.
Yeah, 100%. And it's tough because the other alternative that we're probably going to do is just run a offer of like a free shipping offer in like for new customers, essentially, of like, hey, you not only get this like small introductory offer, but now you also get free shipping via landing pages or something like that, and seeing how it affects performance. But then does that actually, or like not free shipping, but like free shipping over this amount, which they would get free shipping by default because the bundle that they're being offered is over that amount. But like, how does that translate to the rest of the site? And, it's kind of like, again, working within this ambiguity and trying to attack it from different angles to see if we can get really confident in one direction or another.
There's so much thoughtfulness that goes into this, and in the same way that, like, I feel like in like business, like consumer businesses in general, over the last 5 years, there's been this shift from like revenue is king to profitability and contribution margin is king. And I feel like within growth marketing, there's also been a similar, not an analogous shift in the last like 3 to 5 years ago to today, where it's like everyone was talking about volume 2 years ago, 3 years ago, still some people today. And like, I used to think about that a lot too. And I just believe in that less and less now, and really believe that like more intentional, more thoughtful, bigger swings are what's king here. And like, that's coming out in you talking through it. Like, what a great example of how like this surface level metrics is not where we ended. Like, there was so many other metrics to dig into and next steps based on that. And it's like, that's the level of thoughtfulness that's going to drive big. That also like facilitates and ensures that you're only taking big swings if you're putting that level of thoughtfulness into each test that you run. It's just so intentional.
Yeah. And that's why I think CRO is a very difficult service to provide. And so no hate to anybody who is running like a CRO agency. Like, it's hard. It's a really hard thing to scale because, as you can see, you're dealing with a ton of ambiguity, and you need a deep understanding of many different aspects of the business to be able to actually put forward ideas that are going to move the business forward. And so it's a really difficult service to provide at scale, and really even just like one-off. It requires a lot of focus. And so that's why I'm scaling back on doing it as much and doing it with like select clients, and then, building something on the side. So yeah, shout out to anybody building a CRO agency, because it's probably the hardest service business to build.
And the
because
ops
of all
around
that
it is tough. Like, that's what I've noticed the same thing with like the agencies we work with, like the design and dev, like it's a big process that has like a lot of feedback along the way. So like strategy and like analysis is incredibly hard, but then so is just like getting the designs and developments out the door in a non-buggy way. Like, it's just it's hard.
Yeah. There's a lot of work that goes into it. You can get into a nice flow. Like, as far as a process, what I used to do was just run a set number of tests on a set cadence. So like we talked about 2 weeks, 4 weeks, but it's like, hey, when those tests are done, like the next set of tests are ready to go live. Because we've been working on, like, if it was a 4-week cadence, that's why I think people are worried about this duration thing of like letting tests run too long. But it's like, it takes time to make new tests anyway. So like, you're not exactly, by just running tests for a week, like you're probably not running more tests. You're just like being very frantic about it. And so what I like to do is just be on a cadence of like, hey, let's run this test experiment for 4 weeks. That gives us plenty of time to build out the new set of experiments, regardless of how big of a lift it is, in order to get that done. And then we'll have those ready to go that next day, so that when we end the test, we launch a new set of tests. And then that 4 weeks again, like obviously on your second round of that, you're now doing the analysis and really digging into those tests to be like, how do we feel about these? Were these obvious winners or not? Trying to like build up that, understanding of the store, and using that to kind of decide on the next set of tests that you're going to launch and be working on those. And so you get into this cadence where like, hey, every 4 weeks we're testing new stuff, and it just continues to flow, instead of like, I think what a lot of people get stuck in is like, you run a few tests and then like something comes up, and then like you stop for a little bit, or like you run a test for a week and then another one later. And like, it's really hard to keep the moment. Like, once you get the wheels turning and the momentum going, it's kind of easier to keep it going than to just pause and start. And so I like a cadence like that for like a testing program, to just be like, let's just keep testing essentially consistently.
Well, I feel like we could go for another 3 hours, which is why I think we should maybe do a part 2 here sooner rather than later.
Yeah. And we could talk about more of the fun CRO hot takes things that I think, are really, I think are pretty fun to talk through. We have a few in the bag still to talk about.
We haven't even opened up your tweet yet, dude. What do you? All right, cool.
Let's
wrap there. And thanks for coming on. That was really fun. This is only our second CRO episode. I think we have a lot more to do on this.
Yeah, thanks guys. Thanks for having me. Hope it's helpful. And obviously, like, I'm not taking on new like client work or anything right now, but if people want to jam on CRO or have questions or, anything we talked about, just like I'm on Twitter, just send me a DM. I'm always happy to I really like talking about this stuff.
Where
like
can
I'm
people
happy
find you? What's your Twitter handle?
It's at Shane Rostad. Shane Rostad. So it's ShaneRostad. Yeah, and just send me a DM.
DMs are open.
Yeah, we can talk shop. Yeah,
I'm gonna DM you today.
Open for business
later today. Just see how you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, dude. I appreciate it.
Me and my previous best friend in CRO, Ryan Doney, are we mainly just send each other music recs now, so we can get on that. We can get on that thread.
Yeah, dude. I would love that.
That's a wrap on episode 21 of the Marketing Operators Podcast. Shane, thank you so much for joining. That was a information-packed episode. That was incredibly valuable. I'm excited to take some of the insights and go, take action based on them. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners are too. Pretty clear we need to have you back because we got through about, 1/5 of our page of notes here. So thinking about having Shane back for maybe a part 2, part 3 on CRO. So if you have any questions for Shane that you would like us to address, just drop them in the comments of this episode and we'll add them to our call notes. Like I said before, if you're liking the show, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. And thank you to our sponsors, Motion, Rich Panel, Prescient AI, and House.